This is Josh from noRugrats or noRugrats, as it's spelt. I always like to ask my guests, what is your favourite flavour in Magic the Gathering and why?
So the first one that comes to mind straight away is the Gothic horror of Innistrad. That setting across all of the various different stories that have happened on Innistrad, but particularly um, with playing Innistrad Remastered recently, and a lot of the Eldrazi element of the horror. I'm very big on Lovecraft's work, so Shadow over Innistrad or Shadows over Innistrad. That was before I started playing Magic, so I'm allowed to not know the exact spelling, but is quite directly inspired by Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, which is one of his more famous stories. And man, I think that particularly the transformation side of things, I got to pull up some reference cards so I can explain this better. So yeah, like one of my favorite mechanics throughout Magic, both in terms of like a gameplay sense, but also particularly with Shadows over Innistrad, is Madness. Which, for those not familiar, it's basically if you were to discard this card, there's an alternative casting cost that is usually cheaper than if you were just to cast it straight from your hand. And that is a lot of fun gameplay-wise, because there's a lot of silly shenanigans that you can do with that. But particularly with the context of Shadows over Innistrad, it's reflective of the story, the environment, what's happening. Yeah, so Shadows over Innistrad is set where Innistrad's kind of falling apart. Like it's always a bit of a mess. It's always chaotic and not a fun place to be. But this is at a point in the story where a lot of the heroic icons of Innistrad have been corrupted into something sinister. And so a lot of the human citizens of Innistrad are losing their faith in their idols. And by extension, they're losing their sanity. And that's where the madness mechanic comes in, because it's essentially an overlap of a bunch of different ideas within Magic's, lunar narrative design, the combination between story and mechanics, where outside of madness, discarding cards is usually a representation of someone else having control over you. And that can be also a representation of your sanity, as someone's like, if you think of cards as like memories or thoughts, and someone is forcing you to discard a card, it's like they're picking away at your brain and picking away at your sanity. And that's where madness is really fun in Shadows over Innistrad, where it's mostly associated with the vampires. So it's mostly in red and black. And in this point in the story, as all the humans are in disarray and things have fallen apart, a lot of the vampires are using this opportunity to manipulate a lot of the humans against each other, to take control of areas of Innistrad that they wouldn't typically have good footing in. And so having that go along with the mechanical fun, the mechanical insanity of madness is just an awesome combination for me. I'm very much about the lunar narrative combination of mechanics and story.
I think madness is interesting as well because the discarding cards ludonarrative idea, as you say, is losing your mind, losing your thoughts, usually under the control of someone else. But with madness, it turns into something else. It's somewhat creative because discarding the card then allows you to cast it, and so it has that aspect of madness which is not just destructive but somewhat creative, and I think that's an interesting bent to the mechanic.
Yeah, I think a good way to look at it is it being manipulative, because obviously you can just straight cast these cards. I should probably bring up an example of madness. So real simple example with Alchemist Greeting, where it's 5 mana to do 4 damage to a target creature, or the madness cost, so if you were to discard it, it's 2 mana instead. And this idea is basically that, like, because of the fraying sanity of everyone in Innistrad, the vampires are more easily able to manipulate people into doing what they want, to getting their way. And so, in the act of discarding it, in the act of someone losing their sanity, there is this opportunity to get this cheaper casting cost for a very, very brief period. It's a window of opportunity that you got to jump on. And I think that's very cool.
One question about the Ludo narrative, though, is if you are the person, the player is the person undergoing the madness because you're discarding, why do you then get the benefit of the spell when it's someone else doing it to you? Sometimes Magic mechanics don't bear that much scrutiny, but it might be something you have thought on.
So that's what I originally thought as well of, when I first saw Madness, when I was very new to Magic, I was like, this seems very niche of, how many opportunities are there, someone's going to thought seize me or, duress me, and I'm going to have open mana to then, act on the Madness casting cost. And then came to realize that there's a lot of, particularly in red and black, there's already a lot of mechanics where you are forcing yourself to discard. A lot of red cards where, as part of the casting costs, you're discarding a card to then draw more cards. Or in black stuff like Village Rites, where you're sacrificing a creature for a resource, or there's another one that's in standard that I can't remember the name of, but one of the additional costs to casting the card is discarding an additional card. And so when there's this element of chaos where you're throwing things out and you've got this very brief opportunity, I think it kind of works. I do understand the questioning of that train of thought, and I get where you're coming from.
But I think another slightly different tack on that, which is very similar, it's drawing on the same thoughts, is that you as the player, you're making yourself go mad because you're forcing yourself to discard cards, except you know that in that moment of madness, there's sort of a moment of power and you are able to take control of it as the player.
And that lines up so perfectly with the association with vampires that Madness has, where, particularly like, a vampire going blood crazed, and you've got that opportunity that, like, this is an elevated level of power for a brief period.
And it's a very Innistrad sort of theming, because Innistrad is full of people who are pushed to their edge, whether they're werewolves who are humans who then lose control and, at the full moon, or vampires who can become blood crazed, but are also the ultimate beings of nobility and sophistication at the same time. So, you have the Stitches and the necromancers who are really pushing life to its edges as well. And so, it very much is something that fits, one, just the word madness, but even just this theming of to push yourself to the edge of something to gain power. And then some people go one side and some people don't, which is kind of the whole point in Innistrad, where transformation is really the focus. So a question I have, Innistrad obviously started as a Gothic horror set, so it was very much, the vampires, the werewolves, the zombies. And you've said that you like particularly the cosmic horror that was introduced by putting the Eldrazi on Innistrad. It seems to me that they're not necessarily a natural fit with one another. Do you feel the cosmic horror detracts from the Gothic horror, or vice versa? Or do you feel they actually do fit together?
That is an interesting question. I think that they're not necessarily a perfect complement. Now, I think Innistrad's primary focus is Gothic horror. Aside from that, that brief dip into cosmic horror, every time that we've been back to Innistrad since then has been very deeply rooted in just Gothic horror. Like with Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, that's back to werewolves and vampires and rituals and stuff, and we're not really going into the big spaghetti monster trapped in the moon. But the Gothic horror does complement into the cosmic horror of their there's always, with vampires in particular, and even werewolves, where a lot of literature around the idea of a werewolf or were creature of whatever animal is very common for when someone has gone into this werewolf form from their human form. Whatever happens when they are a werewolf, they are not conscious of. It's this, and then you wake up somewhere you're not familiar with. Your clothes are all torn, and it's a lot of Gothic horror plays into this question of sanity and also otherness, which I think werewolves really play a big part in, of having this, persona of humanity in being the in-group, and then werewolves being representative of, you drop that facade and there is this primal creature inside you that isn't necessarily part of the norm. And I think in more classic Gothic literature, that's painted as a negative thing. But in more contemporary Gothic literature, it's explored as an interesting idea rather than werewolves are bad and they're representation of a certain group in society that this writer does not particularly care for. And I think, that sense of otherness, that sense of strangeness, while not a perfect match, they're definitely not exploring the same ideas. I think Innistrad is a good setting to jump into the cosmic horror. I can't think of another plane that would really fit the cosmic horror, though I guess we're going to the Blind Eternities now later this year, so that might be its own idea to explore back then.
Okay, so Innistrad, even Crimson Vow, the wedding set.
Okay, so I took a big break from Magic, and when I got back into it, Crimson Vow was the most recent set, I think. Or one of the more recent sets. It was within the last couple. I really like Crimson Vow mechanically.
Yep.
The surface level aesthetic I enjoy. Narratively, we don't talk about it. There's really not much going on. Like the whole wedding story, Edgar being resurrected, kind of, the whole like tomb flipping card, which I really like that card from a gameplay perspective, but narratively it's like, what are you
just going to sleep for a while?
Yeah. It's a very, very odd set that I think Midnight Hunt is narratively the better set of the two, even though mechanically I'm not as fond of Midnight Hunt.
I think that's right. I think Midnight Hunt was a real story. It was essentially, there's a MacGuffin that needed to be gotten for Teferi for some reason. But, things were happening on Innistrad. It wasn't just a couple of vampires getting married and Chandra and her friends crashing the party. Although I love that art with Chandra in the flaming dress. I just think it's
that's one of the first packs of Crimson Vow I cracked had the borderless Chandra Planeswalker, and I love the art for that one.
She's
gorgeous.
Dressed to kill. The name is the name's a bit much, but I think it just looks fantastic.
I think the name's charming. I get why people don't like it. I get how it falls in the hat set aesthetic, as people have been complaining about a lot. But I think it's a level of corny that works.
Yeah, and the other thing is she would be flaming hot. Like they're going to this very fancy party full of very, very fancy vampires, and so they've got to be dressed the part. The story has this special force field that if you didn't get an invite, you get zapped. And there's a card that shows that. I'll put that on the screen. But I think it's a kill spell, but or a board wipe. By invitation only, it's called.
That's the one, yeah.
You choose a number between 0 and 13, 13 being the Innistrad number, and each player sacrifices that many creatures. Actually, reasonably good board wipe.
Yeah, sacrifice is great.
And has a certain level of modality. So if you're a big board deck, you don't get the disadvantage.
Which in white you're going to be.
Yeah. And you can, keep half your board while everyone else wipes their board. So... yeah, so no, I actually agree. I think Crimson Vow looks great. The idea of the vampire wedding is pretty cool. I don't think there's a whole set in it. And I think in design they were only going to do one set, but they had to make two Innistrad sets at once, and so that's why we ended up with sort of a half-baked idea.
That's interesting. I feel like mechanically, Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow are distinct enough from each other that they work as two separate. I can't imagine them working as a single set.
No. I think like blood tokens are really good, but the flavor is so specific that it's hard to know when they're ever used again. But they are actually a very good mechanic, and
they play really well with Madness.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Thanks for joining us on MTG Flavoursauce. If you like what you see, please like, share, or subscribe. See ya.